Good morning to you folks. Most of you, or some of you know me, Scott Roderick. I'm the son-in-law to Bob and Dot Randolph, and so married their oldest daughter, Cindy. Cindy can't be here, but I have a part of her with me, always with me, as we've been married 40 years. Actually married in this auditorium. But I'm happy to be here with you. But before I get started, I need to make sure I turn off my cell phone. I'd hate for, to get maybe a text. Where I have 4 daughters, I'm on this fam bam. And so sometimes I'll look at my phone and I've got 20 or 30 texts just from that group. And so I'd hate for that to happen. Or, maybe one of my social medias, I get a little notification or something, beep, 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 all during the message. Even worse, maybe my boss calls me, up at Strawberry where we're a camp host or a spam call. So I'd hate any of that communication to happen to me. So that's off, and we'll just throw that in the bag. So we're good. Now, we've been looking at Paul's letter to the Colossians. Now, Paul didn't have all this social media, phone calls, emails, texts, all that kind of stuff to communicate. He had it much simpler, maybe much more difficult. Mike has talked about how this letter written by Paul while in prison, we call them epistles today, but these letters, these epistles, aren't just a simple, hey, love is love, tweet or something like that. They're very complex, multifaceted communications. And we tend to take them, we're taking this letter in weeks, several weeks. But when that letter would have arrived in the church, Colossia or one of the other churches in that valley, they would have notified everyone. We've got this letter from Paul. And, everyone gather. And they would, next Sunday we're going to read it. And that's what they would do. They would come together, and they wouldn't even start until everybody's there, because they know everybody who belongs there. Now, I know Mike's talked about some of his adventures in India. I've had some maybe similar adventures in Africa when, you have a certain time you think you're going to start, but that doesn't matter. It won't start until everybody's there. And it could be an hour, could be several hours later, but then when everybody gets there, it's time to start. Well, we're glad you're here today, whether you're here live or online, and we're ready to get started now that I've got my phone off. But the thing about this letter, okay, the other thing they would have done, they wouldn't have taken several weeks to do it. They would have started reading the letter out loud from the beginning. They all wouldn't have had their own copies, nothing on screen, so they had to listen very closely. And they would read the letter in its entirety. Now, I'm not going to do that today, but that's what they would do. And I'm going to encourage you, the next time this church does a series through one of Paul's letters or a book, that's really one of the best ways to study it. See, Colossians is like 6 pages in your Bible. And think what would happen if at the beginning of the series, if you would have just sat down and read the whole book, the whole letter as it is, in one sitting. And maybe each week before the series, before the weekend message, again, you sat down and read it, the whole letter again. An important thing is you would know the context, but also you would be ready for Mike, Derek, or myself when we were talking about this. So I encourage you to do that. Now, part of the reason why I ask you to do that, or encourage you to do that, is because, I mentioned my wife, Cindy. She's really amazing, and she sent me with a couple things here. Okay? I don't know if you can see these, but it's two balls of yarn. Okay? Two balls of yarn. And one green and one orange here. And the amazing thing about my wife is she can take these two balls of yarn and knit and crochet and make some amazing things. Okay? Oh, hey, she sent me with an example here. How about that? Okay? So here is one thing that she's done. All right? And this has got some crochet and knit on it, and it's a kind of women's poncho. Now, the thing is about this thing, it's kind of this clothes, piece of garment, piece of artwork, but it all comes together from lines, okay, strings. She's going to hate me for this. Strings of yarn linked together. And I show you that because that's what Paul's letters are. And I think especially has two important concepts that I want to share with you today that link together all the other concepts that we're going to talk about today and you've talked about in his letters. So those two great concepts, those two overwhelming themes run through this letter. And the first theme explains what God is up to. Now, maybe you've looked at your life at times and looked at other people's lives, and you looked at this world, and you've wondered, what is God up to? And this theme actually appears in pretty much every book of the Bible. But where we're most familiar with it is at the end of the book of Revelation, where Jesus says, "Behold, I make all things new." Behold, I make all things new. That is what God is all about, making all things new. Now, last week, Derek was here, and he reminded us about Jesus' death and resurrection. And this is the greatest event in all of history, where God launched that heavenly purpose. Now, the thing is, God, though, launched it at the resurrection, but he's continuing it. He's continuing to make all things new. And he's doing it not only himself, but he's doing it in us and through us. And he'll continue that until he returns and finishes making all things new. Now, my wife and I, we work at Strawberry Reservoir. We are camp hosts in Loop G. She's actually working right now, okay? But typically, we go through this cycle that, campers come and we can have about almost 60 campsites just in our loop. That's a lot of people camping for the weekend. Any of you guys like to camp, maybe in an RV or tent, something? We got a few of you? Yeah. Okay, so you know what we're talking about here. So let's say 60 campsites, all those campsites averaging 4, 6, 8 people. There's a lot of people there. Well, they're having campfires and eating meals, and they're catching fish, and they're doing all these things. They may be doing some things also that we got to encourage them not to do. Okay? Like pretty much every weekend, someone takes their vehicle and drives right across the grass and sagebrush. Now, up in Strawberry, that's a national forest campground. Okay? So it's not actually in Utah. It's in the state, but it's all federal. And there's some things that the national forest frowns on. One thing is vehicles on the grass. Okay? And so you know, when a car just kind of runs across the grass, it's kind of hard on the grass. And if a car did that week after week after week, man, maybe you came up and camped up there in, let's say, end of August or Labor Day weekend. Can you imagine what that grass and sagebrush is going to look like, okay, if it hasn't burned up? So our job is Sunday afternoon, wave goodbye as everybody drives out, okay? And then I'll make a run kind of smelling and looking, because oftentimes I'll find a campfire that wasn't completely put out. So I got to make sure the place doesn't burn down, okay? I got to pick up all their trash. Cindy's mostly cleans bathrooms. She's got the hard job. And so we do all this, and after a couple days, we have done our best to make Luke G new again. Because that's what God has called us to do, is make all things new again. Now, this being our third season of this, you know what I've learned? A couple things about myself is I'm very limited. No matter how hard we work to make things new again, it's that next weekend is just not as nice as it was the weekend before. Okay? I can go to a site 2 or 3 times in a week and still find trash. Think, hey, I thought I picked up every piece of trash here. And there it is, some more trash, and no one has camped there. So I'm very limited. The other thing is my frailty, my flawed life, is I don't see all the trash. I miss stuff and don't get it quite made new again for the next weekend's campers. But you know what? God is okay with that. No matter how hard we strive to make things new again in our relationships, in our workplace, wherever we're doing that, God is pleased. And he knows that you and I are limited and flawed and frail. And so no matter how hard or how well we do at making things new, we can be confident that Jesus is going to more than make up for what we don't have. So that's one thing. As we look at this letter, just to remember the importance that God is making all things new. Now, the other part of this is I got to tell you this other story about a dog. Now, I know Mike likes to tell you stories about his dog sometimes, okay? But when Cindy and I lived here, we lived out in Sugar House in the 80s, and one day this dog showed up, okay? It was about an 8-9-month-old black and tan dog, and it had been living on the street. And so we have 2 dogs now. We've had 2 dogs that we've lived with us for 14 years. Now, that's Diesel and Dakota. Now, my girls named those dogs. You see, after the dog that we had here in Utah, they don't let me name the dogs anymore. Now, what was the name of that dog that was with us here? That dog's name was Hesed. Now, I know that's a very common dog name. You've probably heard it a lot. Now, so actually people ask us, what in the world does Hesed mean? Hesed. And I explained to them, very simple, that Hesed means acting in the other's best interest with affection. That's a good name for a dog, isn't it? Well, we had hoped that by naming this dog Hesed, that yes, Hesed would act in our best interest, and that we knew we were acting in his best interest because we were taking him off the street. This dog, at times, was involved in raiding garbages. That's how it survived. And so it no longer had to do that. But one thing we learned about Hesed is that, yeah, oftentimes didn't do too good a job about acting in our best interest. Pretty good with affection, okay? Now this word, Hesed, and its definition also appears in our Bible. That's why I picked it up. Now, in our Bible, especially in the Hebrew, the Old Testament, you're going to see these other words: loving kindness, steadfast or loyal love, and mercy. So when you read it, Old Testament, and you see those words, oftentimes it's going to be this Hebrew word, Hesed, which means acting in the other's best interest with affection. So notice it's not a cold, yeah, I'm going to do what's best for you, whether I like it or not. Okay? It's with affection. And notice it's not all about emotion. Okay? Because it's a decision. It's a mind. It's a response. Acting in the other's best interest with affection. The interesting thing is that this adjective is used most often in the Hebrew Bible to describe God. So you want to know, what kind of God is it in the Bible? What kind of God do we know and knows us and do we worship? It's a God who acts in your best interest with affection. Whenever he does something, he's doing something to you for your best interest, and he's doing it with affection. That's what the Hebrews understood. It was ingrained in their thinking and their actions. And you remember Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Well, Jesus comes on the scene, another Jew, and he then, speaking more in Aramaic, we have it written in Greek, so we don't have the word Hesed, but we have what Jesus did to use that concept of Hesed into 4 words he often used. These 4 words were love, serve, submit, and obey. Now, if you've read much of Jesus' words, you know he liked to use those 4 words a lot. And he used these words pretty much interchangeably and in their respect to communicate Hesed. Okay? How do you love someone? You act in their best interest with affection. How do you serve someone? Okay? And Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Well, you act in their best interest with affection. Submit. Now, in our culture, in our thinking, we think more that's something that you're forced to do. See, Jesus is talking about here's something that you choose to do. I submit to you because I'm acting in your best interest with affection. If I'm going to obey you, I'm doing so because I'm acting in your best interest with affection. There's a great movie. It's an old movie now. It's classic. It's called The Princess Bride. Oh, good, you know it. Okay? Great story. It's about this farm girl, and her dad, the farmer, kind of hires this poor servant boy and to help out on the work, the chores on the farm. You know, because he just has a daughter, and, you know, and I think he's getting old. You never see, actually, the farmer. You see the farm girl, and you see the farm boy. At least that's what she called him. Hey, farm boy, do this for me. Hey, farm boy, do this for me. Hey, farm boy, get this chore done. And every time she responded and asked, the farm boy, Wesley was his name. She just didn't use it as his name. Wesley had one response. That response was, As you wish. You see, Wesley got what we were talking about here. Okay? Wesley right away came to love the farm girl, even though she didn't treat him so well in the start. But over time, because of Wesley's verbal response and responsive actions, every time she asked him to do something, as you wish, softened her heart. And the movie turns into a great story of what kind of love? True love or true love. Yeah, so if you get a chance, catch that movie. Because as you wish is a perfect example of Hesed. All right, so now we know these two concepts. We're ready to kind of get more into today's passage in Colossians. You see, in the first century, in Jesus and Paul's century, Western culture viewed women, children, and slaves as man's property. Okay, we got to understand that. That was culture. Christ, however, and his church were to view women, children, and slaves as highly valued members of the kingdom. So we're going to kind of dig in here the next few minutes into this almost the end of this letter. But I'm going to kind of change the order a bit, if that's okay. We're going to start with the passages about slaves, regarding slaves. Now, I want to say, first of all, that Paul was anti-slavery. However, in the first century, Rome, not Paul, not the church, Rome controlled power, politics, and the culture. Rome was aggressively pro-slavery. Rome was built, not just the city, but the empire of Rome was built on slaves. Now, in some urban areas in the Roman Empire, some urban areas comprised of 30% of the population as slaves. Okay? Can you imagine that? Rome and many of the other cities, the urban big cities, 30% of their population were slaves. Very common then. Okay? And matter of fact, to defy Rome on the slave issue really was hazardous. Could mean death. What's so fascinating about our Bibles, this letter, for one thing, at the end, we'll talk about, and Paul will recognize a slave. Okay? But in another letter, a personal letter, Paul writes to Philemon. And in that letter, he writes to Philemon, who is a slave owner. Paul teaches him how to think as a Messiah-shaped kingdom person, and allowing the Messiah's cross and resurrection to reshape his thoughts, his actions, and even his relationship with the slave, Onesimus. Paul saw a way to address the slave issues and build the church. So, to understand Paul's words in our Western culture, what we can do in this passage is we can replace slave with the word employee. Okay? And we can change the word master with either owner or manager. So that's what we're going to do. So in chapter 4, verse 1 of Colossians, Paul writes this: Masters, treat your bondservants justly and fairly, knowing that you also have a master in heaven. So what I'm suggesting to you is, owners, do you own a business? Do you manage a business? then what Paul would say to you is treat your employees justly, fairly. And remember, owners, managers, you too have a master in heaven. Think about how your master treats you and understand that's how you are to treat your employees. That's revolutionary. That's revolutionary in the first century, and it's pretty alarming maybe in the 21st century. Think about a CEO of Microsoft or Facebook, Google, any big CEOs, Fortune 500 businesses. If they were to treat their employees justly and fairly, with hesed, would be transforming. And then Paul goes on, bondservants, slaves, employees, to help us understand it. Obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord, being in awe of the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. You see, up at Strawberry, when I used to work at a church, the senior pastor, I didn't consider my boss. Great guy and all that kind of thing. And I listened to him, and sometimes, we had conversations. But beyond that, God was my boss. Well, now I work for this as a seasonal employee. I have an area manager, and there's corporate, and then there's this group of investors. Okay, so it's quite confusing. And so you got to weigh things out and figure things out. And it can be confusing unless I stay focused on who I really work for, even in the job I'm doing now, is God. That's what Paul's getting at. And I work hard for me to say that, heartily for the Lord. He says, you are serving the Lord Christ. Moving on with Galatians, let's talk about children. Colossians, let's talk about children and parents. Not too long ago at Strawberry, again, Sunday, and I was kind of later in the afternoon, so most everyone has left, okay? I tell you, we go from 60 sites on the weekend to maybe 4, 5, 6 sites. It's quiet. The animals start coming out again, and it's just fascinating. Well, a couple Sundays ago, I think I was taking a break, having lunch or something, and I hear this run through our loop and flying out, and I go looking out to see this little motorcycle. Okay? Powered motorcycle. This wasn't an e-bike. This was a motorcycle. Okay? And on this little motorcycle, unlicensed motorcycle, was a little person. Okay? A child, a juvenile. Now again, I told you, see, up there, it's federal. Maybe in rural areas of Utah, maybe in some Utah state parks, it's okay to drive unlicensed vehicle, OHVs, that kind of stuff, and it doesn't matter what age you are. But not in the national forest. Not through my campground. But by the time I ran out there, that person was gone out the gate. Huh. Well, a little while ago, later, heard this noise again. I go out and again catch the back end, and there was this dad kind of with them with on a couple little electric scooters, okay, foot scooters with a couple kids. I said, "Hey, is she with you?" And he goes, "No." I go, "Oh, all right, you're okay. Keep going." Well, finally, the third time, I hear the sound. I go running out my rig, and she's coming in this time. She's not going out. And I start waving her down, get her to stop. And about that time, now for the first time, someone pulls up right behind her. Her dad. Okay? And right away he says, "Don't talk to her." So I tried to explain to him now. I said, "Okay, you want me to talk to her? I'll talk to you." I didn't say that to him, but that's what I'm thinking. So I'm trying to let him know that he could get a very big ticket from a sheriff or from the Forest Service for riding in this area. And he's trying to explain to me that the size of the CCs, yada, yada, yada kind of thing. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's not going to matter. That sheriff's not going to care. Yada, yada, yada. And so my point being with this is what this little girl was observing, and then what she even tried to do was say, "Dad, let's just go." Because she could see that her dad automatically was creating a confrontation. And she wanted out of it. Notice here in verse 20, "Children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Fathers," the next verse says, "do not provoke your children." This man, you could tell, provoked his daughter in many occasions. He was showing and teaching her, in this case by example, to disobey. That you can do what you please to do. And it doesn't matter what anyone else says. She wasn't going for it at that moment. So that's just a very negative example of the opposite of what Paul is calling fathers and children to do. Josh McDowell. Some of you are old enough to remember Josh McDowell, but he was very well known for these two phrases: rules without relationships. Rules without relationship leads to rebellion. And he said, relationship, though, without rules leads to resentment. Okay? So this daughter, you could see in my example here, was already resenting the kind of person, the kind of fathering that this dad did. Maybe they had a relationship, but he was making sure that nothing had rules for her. Finally, we're ending up here with the relationship for husbands and wives. And Paul writes here, "Wives, submit to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord." Now, women, do you just kind of cringe there? Now, I think one of the reasons, again, because of the culture and how in the first century women were viewed, is one reason why Paul is starting with the message to wives. And then he says, "Husbands, love your wives." See, I know in our culture we kind of love things and, like people or something. Okay? And so Paul's getting at here to the men, no. See, your wife is not a possession. Okay? God is calling you to love her as you wish when she makes requests. to love her and not be harsh with her. And women to choose. Remember, Jesus used love, serve, submit, and obey interchangeably. Dr. John Gottman, he's often considered the grandfather of modern relationships thinking. Now, Gottman was a young psychology professor in the 70s, and he thought, why doesn't anyone do any real relationship research? Okay? Back in the 70s, it was like, here, complete this survey, and that's how we decided, what people thought about their marriages and relationships kind of thing. Not real scientific, not very, trustworthy. Or counselors would talk about, oh, here's my interpretation, here's my understanding of it. So Gottman, he actually, on the University of Washington campus, got a room, a house, on the nice place on the river, ducks and all this kind of stuff, and they would have couples come in and spend the weekend. And they said, just be a couple. Just enjoy your weekend. And no one's going to bother you until the end of the weekend. Well, they also had to agree that they could be observed and videotaped. All right? So after years and decades and time of research, people would come back, and hundreds and thousands of couples have gone through this, that Gottman started seeing some patterns. Gottman, interesting, is a Jewish believer. And so over time, Gottman and his associates really identified two groups of people. One was marriage disasters. Okay? Again, similarities. That over and over again, these couples did these things, and they were marriage disasters. And otherwise, other couples did certain things, and they were marriage masters. Oh, okay, we're not ready for that. Not my fault. Okay, but marriage master. Okay, so what did some of the marriage disasters do? You may be wondering, right? And let me give you these. Marriage disasters, criticism. You know what criticism is. It's attacks on one's character and one's personality. You always do this. You've never done this, no matter how many times I've asked, okay? So, some criticism. So that's one of the things. The next one is contempt. Contempt is a form of disrespect. Sarcasm, cynicism, name-calling, rolling your eyes at your spouse, okay? Mockery. Another one is defensiveness. It's not me, it's you that's the problem, okay? And then lastly, stonewalling. You just tune them out. Now, these four things the marriage disasters did, and what Gottman came to call the four horsemen. Okay, he took that out of the book of Revelation, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's different four horsemen, but the four horsemen in Revelation are associated with terrible things as well as these. Now let's look at, as we're finishing up, the marriage masters. Okay, what did they do? Marriage masters, they build friendship and trust, for one thing. Okay, they express appreciation, they manage conflict, and they build shared dreams. So how do they do it? First of all, they listen. They listen to each other. And Gottman even comes up with this one thing is, if you come home, COVID's changed a lot of things. We don't go to work, some of us, okay, anymore. We work at home. But if you go off to work somewhere, what he said is at your end of your day, when you come home, two things: give your spouse a 6-second kiss. There's only a few giggles. I thought there would be a lot more. No, I'm serious. He said you come home and greet your spouse with a 6-second. He's timed it out. This guy's you got to understand how some of these researchers are. They're very, very specific. Data, 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 data. Okay? So 6-second kiss, and then you say, how was your day? And you know what you do for 10 minutes? You listen. You don't try to solve it, okay? You just listen and support your spouse. And then for another 10 minutes, you switch. And so it helps you practice listening. As a camp host, I try to do that so much. So much, because people come up, these people stayed up too late, made this generator, and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, so, you spend a lot of time listening. Why can't I drive my OHV on this ground? Listen to them. I'm sorry that upsets you, But you start by listening. Then you ask, right? Ask. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus has spent a lot of time looking and listening to people. And you know what he says to them? After watching them, how are we doing, Anna Grace? Okay, thank you. So, she was my timekeeper. She's doing a great job, I'm not. So Jesus, I'm going to make this quick. Jesus said, we know it this way, judge not so that you not be. The word there in the Greek is criticize. Jesus is watching their behavior and he says, let me take that criticism from you. Because they were using, as we do, criticism to manipulate others to get what we want. One, it's not very effective, and two, it's very damaging to our relationships. So Jesus says, don't criticize. Don't judge others. Let me take that from you. And they go, now what do we do? What do we do to get what we want? And later on, Jesus says what? Ask. Ask, seek, knock. And he's talking about ask this of the Father. Don't try to manipulate the Father. Ask you need something. Don't try to manipulate your children, your spouse, your friends, your coworkers. Ask. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yeah, but what if they don't do what I ask? That's right. They're more likely to if you ask in the way you ask. But still, you risk that chance. You take that risk that they're not going to fulfill that. But that's okay. You are not in control of them. Gary Smalley, he's now deceased. He was a real famous marriage Christian counselor and communicator in the Christian circle. And he used to talk about control. If you can't go like this. No, go ahead. Go ahead, just reach your hands together. Okay? Now, whenever you're looking for something to control, okay, realize you can control everything that fits into that circle. Yeah, some of you are trying. Yeah, let me know how well that works for you. So the important thing is the marriage masters asked. Okay? They didn't manipulate. The other thing they expressed appreciation. Now notice in Paul's letter here in Colossians, and all of his letters, he starts his letters typically with appreciation. Appreciation to whom? To God. Okay? He usually starts with appreciation to God. And he ends his letters, now you know, with appreciation to who? He starts naming people, right? So appreciation to others. So express your appreciation. And then our last thing here, step into their world. Step into their world. And band, you can start coming up now, because I'm way over. I apologize for that. I missed my cue, Anna Grace. But step into their world. So fathers and mothers, too many parents want kids to join and do their things that they like to do. You got to step into their world, okay? Husbands, step into your wives' world and join them in things. I tried to get my wife, I think most of you know, for the last 3 years, we've been living full-time in an RV. We've been trying to do this big trip all the way to Alaska and a one-year trip and this kind of thing. Well, several years ago, I tried to get my wife to go on a yacht, a big catamaran in the Caribbean. I thought that'd be a nice place to live for a time in our... We tried it. We went down and spent a week on a catamaran with other people, went through some full training, full certification for me for a catamaran, and she got some other certification. It was a great time, and she came away from that saying, yeah, I don't want to do this. Okay? And so as we continue to talk about shared goals and stepped into each other's world, this is where we ended up, is on the road in a big fifth wheel. And what great adventures we've had. So that's my encouragement to you. And like I said, all these things that we've been talking about today is all based upon the idea that God is making all things new. And He's called you to be part of that great adventure. And your tool for doing it, is Hesed. Act in each other's best interests with affection. Will you pray with me? Father God, I just thank you for this church, for Mike and the staffs and the elders and their leadership, and just, Father, for the days that are ahead. Father, I pray for this upcoming faith series in the fall, and that just for more people to be stepping up to lead groups, and that I pray that everyone in this church, that all adults especially, will jump in and be a part of each one of those messages and be a part of a group. And together as a church, they just have their faith expanded in great ways, Lord. And I just pray these things now in the name of Jesus. Amen.